Cameras were rolling live. 300 audience members. Millions watching at home. And then Natalia Dyer saw the face. Jimmy Fallon had done this thousands of times. The rhythm was second nature. Welcome the guest, share a laugh, ask about the new project, maybe play a game, send them off with applause. 15 years of hosting The Tonight Show had made him a master of controlled chaos. The kind of polished spontaneity that looks effortless but requires absolute precision. Tonight's guest was Natalia Dyer, the breakout star who had captured hearts worldwide. She walked onto the stage in an elegant dress, waving to the crowd, that familiar smile lighting up the studio. The band played. The audience cheered. Jimmy stood to greet her with his trademark enthusiasm. Everything was going exactly as planned. Natalia settled into the guest chair, crossing her legs, her hands folded comfortably in her lap. Jimmy shuffled his blue cards, glanced at the teleprompter, and launched into his first question about her latest film project. She answered with charm and wit, the conversation flowing naturally. The audience laughed at all the right moments. The cameras captured every angle. This was television perfection. But 30 seconds into her second answer, something changed. Natalia's voice faltered. Her eyes drifted past Jimmy, past the cameras, toward the tiered audience seating on her right. Her smile froze. Her hands, which had been gesturing animatedly, stopped mid-air and slowly lowered to grip the armrests of her chair. Jimmy noticed immediately. Any host would. He paused, tilted his head slightly, his professional instincts kicking in. You okay? He asked, his tone light, assuming she'd lost her train of thought or needed a moment. Natalia didn't respond. She wasn't listening. Her entire body had gone rigid, her gaze locked onto something, or someone. In the third row of the audience, the studio fell into confused silence. Jimmy Fallon stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The band members looked at each other. Questlove's drumsticks hovered motionless above his kit. The audience members began turning in their seats, following Natalia's line of sight, trying to understand what had captured her attention so completely. And then, without warning, Natalia Dyer stood up. Not the casual standing of someone stretching their legs. Not the polite rising to excuse herself. This was abrupt. Urgent. Her chair scraped backward with an audible screech against the studio floor. Jimmy's blue cards slipped from his fingers and scattered across his desk. Natalia? Jimmy's voice carried genuine concern now, no longer the smooth host voice but something raw and human. She didn't answer. She was already moving. Natalia stepped off the elevated platform where the guest chair sat, her heels clicking rapidly against the studio floor. She walked straight toward the audience section, her eyes never leaving that third row. The cameras scrambled to follow her, operators frantically adjusting their angles to capture this completely unscripted moment. The audience parted instinctively, people leaning back in their seats to create a path. Some whispered to each other. Others pulled out their phones. Most simply stared in stunned silence, unable to process what they were witnessing. Jimmy stood behind his desk, one hand gripping its edge, completely paralyzed. In 15 years of live television, through countless surprise guests, unexpected pranks, and spontaneous musical performances, he had never, not once, had a guest simply leave the interview and walk into the crowd. Natalia reached the third row and stopped in front of an elderly woman with white hair pulled back in a neat bun. The woman sat perfectly still, both hands clasped together in her lap, her weathered face a mask of shock and disbelief. Her eyes, magnified slightly behind thin-framed glasses, were wide and glistening. The studio's overhead lights illuminated the scene with brutal clarity. Every camera in the building was now pointed at this moment. The control room was in chaos. Producers shouting into headsets, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial, nobody knowing what to do because nothing like this had ever happened before. Natalia dropped to her knees in the narrow space between the rows of seats. The elderly woman's hands flew to her mouth. A small, choked sound escaped her throat, half gasp, half sob. Natalia reached forward and took those trembling hands in her own. Abuela? Natalia's voice cracked, barely audible over the studio's sound system but caught perfectly by the boom microphones overhead. The woman nodded, tears now streaming freely down her lined cheeks. Mija, she whispered back. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened 12 years earlier. Natalia Dyer wasn't always Natalia Dyer, household name and beloved actress. She was once just Natalia, a 13-year-old girl living in Nashville with divorced parents, splitting time between two households, struggling with the typical chaos of adolescence compounded by an unusual dream. She wanted to act. Not the casual, maybe I'll try theater class kind of wanting. The consuming, all-encompassing, every waking thought kind of dream. She watched films obsessively, studied performances, practiced monologues in her bedroom mirror until her mother banged on the door asking her to please go to sleep. Her father thought it was a phase. Her friends didn't understand the intensity of it. But her grandmother, her abuela, Maria Elena Reyes, understood completely. Maria Elena had emigrated from Colombia 40 years earlier with nothing but 2 suitcases and a fierce determination to build a better life. She worked 3 jobs to put Natalia's mother through college. She cleaned houses during the day, worked in a restaurant kitchen at night, and sold homemade empanadas at weekend markets. She never complained. She never stopped. By the time Natalia was born, Maria Elena was living in a small but comfortable apartment in Nashville, retired but still vibrant, still full of that same fierce energy that had carried her across borders and through decades of hard work. She was the one who drove 13-year-old Natalia to her first audition in Atlanta, a 5-hour drive each way. She was the one who sat in waiting rooms while Natalia read for casting directors. She was the one who held Natalia while she cried after rejections, who celebrated with elaborate home-cooked meals after callbacks, who never once suggested that this dream might be impractical or unlikely. "You have something special, Mija," Maria Elena would say, gripping Natalia's face between her worn hands. "I see it. The world will see it too. You just have to keep showing them." For 3 years, this was their routine. Auditions in Atlanta, Memphis, even a few trips to Los Angeles. Natalia's mother helped when she could, but she worked long hospital shifts as a nurse. Maria Elena became Natalia's constant companion, her coach, her biggest champion. And then came the audition that changed everything. Natalia was 16 when she got the call back for a new Netflix series, a science fiction show about kids in a small town dealing with supernatural events. It was a long shot. Hundreds of girls had auditioned. The producers were looking for something specific, something indefinable. Maria Elena drove Natalia to the final audition in Los Angeles. They couldn't afford a hotel, so they slept in the car in a Walmart parking lot the night before. Maria Elena woke up early, went into the store, bought the ingredients for breakfast, and cooked eggs and toast on a camping stove in the parking lot. She braided Natalia's hair with steady, practiced fingers. She straightened the collar of Natalia's audition outfit. She held her granddaughter's face one more time. "Show them," she said simply. Natalia walked into that audition room and gave the performance of her young life. 2 weeks later she got the call. She had been cast as Nancy Wheeler in Stranger Things. Her life changed overnight. The show became a global phenomenon. Natalia went from unknown teenager to recognized actress. Interview requests flooded in. Magazine covers. Award shows. Her face on billboards. The schedule became brutal. Filming for months at a time in Atlanta. Press tours that spanned continents. Appearances, premieres, photo shoots. Natalia was living the dream she chased so desperately, but the cost was steep. She was never home. Maria Elena understood. Of course she understood. This was what they'd worked for. But understanding didn't make the distance easier. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became impossible. Natalia's life had accelerated beyond anything either of them could have imagined. Behind the scenes, Natalia made a decision that defied every expectation. 3 years into Stranger Things' success, Maria Elena got sick. It started as fatigue. Then the doctor visits. Then the diagnosis: advanced pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The prognosis was measured in months, not years. Natalia's mother called her on set. Natalia remembers the exact moment. She was in her Nancy Wheeler costume, waiting between takes, and her phone buzzed with her mother's ringtone. She remembers stepping outside the soundstage into the Georgia humidity. She remembers the way her mother's voice broke when she said the word cancer. Natalia flew to Nashville immediately. She sat beside Maria Elena's hospital bed and held her grandmother's hand, the same hand that had gripped the steering wheel for countless hours of driving to auditions, the same hand that had cooked thousands of meals, the same hand that had held Natalia's face and told her she was special. "I'm so proud of you, Mija," Maria Elena whispered, her voice thin and tired. "I always knew. You made this possible," Natalia said, tears streaming down her face. "Everything I have is because of you." Maria Elena smiled. "Then promise me something. Anything. Don't forget where you came from. Don't forget the people who drove you to those auditions. Don't let this business make you someone I wouldn't recognize," Natalia promised. She stayed in Nashville for 2 weeks before her work obligations forced her back to Atlanta. She promised Maria Elena she'd return soon. She promised they'd have more time. But Maria Elena died 3 days later, alone in her hospital room in the early hours of morning, while Natalia was on an airplane heading to a press appearance she couldn't cancel. Natalia made it back for the funeral. She gave a eulogy that barely made it through. She helped sort through Maria Elena's belongings. The modest apartment filled with photos of Natalia at various ages, news clippings about Stranger Things carefully cut out and saved in a scrapbook, a worn copy of Natalia's first professional headshot framed on the mantel. In the months that followed, Natalia threw herself into work. Filming. Press. More filming. More press. She told herself that keeping busy was healthy, that Maria Elena would want her to keep pushing forward, keep succeeding. But grief doesn't work like that. It doesn't fade because you ignore it. It waits. And tonight, in front of 300 studio audience members and millions of viewers at home, it finally caught up. The elderly woman in the third row wasn't Maria Elena Reyes. That would have been impossible. But she looked remarkably like her, the same white hair, the same thin-framed glasses, the same way of sitting with both hands clasped together, the same warmth in her eyes. When Natalia had glanced toward the audience during her interview, intending only to connect with the crowd as actors are trained to do, she saw that face. And for one impossible, heart-stopping moment, her brain insisted it was her grandmother. Logic didn't matter. Reason didn't matter. The grief she'd been carrying for 9 years erupted with volcanic force. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Natalia was still kneeling in front of the elderly woman, still holding her hands. The woman, whose name was Dorothy Martinez, a retired teacher from New Jersey who had won tickets to The Tonight Show through a radio contest, was crying openly now, overwhelmed by this incomprehensible situation. Jimmy Fallon had made a decision. He stepped out from behind his desk. Not the performative stepping out he did for comedy bits. This was different. He walked across the studio floor with purpose, his expression serious, and joined Natalia beside the third row. The cameras followed him. The control room stopped shouting. Everyone understood, on some instinctive level, that they were witnessing something real. Jimmy crouched down beside Natalia. "Hey," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "What's happening? Talk to me." Natalia looked at him, and the professional mask she'd worn for years completely shattered. "She looks like my grandmother," she said, her voice breaking. "She looks exactly like her." Dorothy Martinez, understanding now, reached forward and pulled Natalia into an embrace. This complete stranger, this woman who had simply wanted to see a fun television show, held a famous actress while she sobbed into her shoulder, while 300 people watched in reverent silence, while cameras broadcast this raw moment of human grief and connection to the world. Jimmy straightened up and addressed the studio audience. His voice carried that rare quality of absolute sincerity. "Folks, I think we need to take a moment here." He gestured to the band. "Guys, can we just pause everything?" The band stopped. The audience stilled. Even the cameraman seemed to move more carefully, more respectfully. Jimmy looked directly into camera one. "If you're watching at home, something real is happening right now. Natalia just saw someone in our audience who reminds her of someone very important. And I think what we're all remembering right now is that behind every performance, behind every interview, there's a real person. With real memories. Real loss. Real love." He paused, then made a decision that would define his legacy as more than just a host. Jimmy walked back to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a simple notepad and pen. He returned to Natalia and Dorothy, still embracing in the third row. He knelt beside them. "Dorothy," he said gently, "would you mind writing your address on this? I think Natalia might want to stay in touch." Dorothy's hands trembled as she wrote. Natalia watched her tears, then slowly reached up and removed the delicate silver necklace she was wearing, the last gift her grandmother had given her. "I want you to have this," Natalia whispered, fastening it around Dorothy's neck. "She would have wanted someone like you to have it." The studio erupted in applause. Not the manufactured TV applause. Real, thunderous, cathartic applause. People were standing. Crying. The Roots played a soft, gentle melody. Jimmy helped both women to their feet. That night, The Tonight Show didn't finish its scheduled segments. There was no game. No musical performance. Jimmy simply stood with Natalia and Dorothy while the audience celebrated this moment of raw humanity. 3 months later, Natalia attended Dorothy's 75th birthday party in New Jersey. She brought her mother. They stayed the whole weekend. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.